Hello, and welcome to the fifth webinar in our series based on the new Oxford University Press book, Putting Purpose into Practice. Following the unfortunate postponement of last week's webinar due to unforeseen circumstances, we are finding a new date for the Roots of the Economics of Mutuality at Mars session. We will share the new details in due course. The topic of today's webinar is the power of investment to achieve purpose. It will last for 1 hour, including a Q&A section at the end. Please submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function at any point during the session. We will be considering Chapter 18, The Influence of Large Investment Funds, which you can read online for free at purposeintopractice.org. In next week's webinar, we will discuss education and the economics of mutuality with Marie-Laure Salles, Director of the Graduate Institute Geneva, and Anne Florini, Clinical Professor at Thunderbird School of Management. Recordings of previous webinars in the series are available to watch online at purposeintopractice.org. I will now hand over to the book's co-editor, who will introduce you to today's speakers. Colin Mayer, CBE, is Peter Moore's Professor of Management Studies at Saïd Business School. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to today's fourth webinar in the series. To date, in the first 3 sessions of the series, we've looked at the purpose of business, enacting and embedding purpose in business, and measuring purpose. The first session brought out the urgency of the agenda of putting purpose at the heart of business and ensuring that the principles of the economics of mutuality are used to embed purpose in their core activities. It discussed what it takes for companies to bring about the necessary reforms that are required to place purpose at the heart of their businesses. The second session looked at how to do that in practice and how the adoption of meaningful challenges and solving the problems of people and planet profitably can be implemented in organizations. It looked at what that means in terms of the formulation of corporate strategy and the enacting of purpose throughout organizations. We discussed the process of ecosystem mapping and management, which is key to the adoption of purpose in organizations. The third session looked at the measurement of purpose. It discussed how systems of standardization of metrics are emerging and the implications of that for the adoption of purpose in businesses. It also looked at what was required for companies to be able to measure purpose within their organizations and ecosystems and ensure that the resources required to implement it are available. Today, we turn to the vital question of the role of institutional investors and how they can play a key role in terms of promoting the adoption of purpose in businesses. Why is corporate purpose important for institutional investors, and how do they stand to benefit from it? How can companies ensure that their investors, as well as their own organizations, are aligned with their purposes, and what is required for institutional investors to be confident about the adoption of purposes in companies in which they are investing? Is ESG sufficient to the task? Or will we need other tools to put corporate purpose at the heart of the investment community as well as companies? To introduce the session and the speakers, I'll now hand over to Bruno Roche, who is a co-editor of the book, Putting Purpose into Practice, The Economics of Mutuality. He's the founder and leader of the Economics of Mutuality platform, and he's the former chief economist at Mars Incorporated and head of its think tank, Mars Catalyst. Bruno.
Thank you, Colin. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. And I would like to introduce this panel, which is actually an important one because it talks about the role and the power of the investment committee to help companies achieve their purpose. And purpose has been an important topic over the last few years. Is becoming even, some say, a movement, and it's meant actually to transform fundamentally the role of capitalism in society. But companies alone cannot achieve purpose. It requires also the full and dedicated commitment from the investment committees. And the investment committees is also widely scattered around different objectives. And there are many types of investors. There are many types also of companies interested in the investment role. And today's panel is a modest attempt to, in a sense, understand why and how the investment community is so critical to help companies achieve their purpose, and in turn, help companies solve problems in society in a way that is profitable for all stakeholders. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you to two friends of the Economics of Mutuality movement. The first one is Dr. Celeste Turco. She's an expert in sovereign wealth funds, and she's currently director at NEOM investment fund, which is part of the Saudi sovereign fund. And NEOM is a quite impressive initiative, which is all about designing the city of the future. And we, in the sense that it is meant to incorporate smart city technologies, and as you say in your website, to be a destination and a home for people who dream big and want to participate in building a new model for sustainable living. Celeste is also an ardent proponent of the responsible and sustainable finance and has followed the work of Economics of Mutuality closely over the last years. She holds a PhD in political theory from Georgetown University and Lewis Business School in Italy. Welcome, Celeste. Second speaker is Tim Wong. Tim is currently based in Singapore, and he's the managing director and head of DBS, which stands for Development Bank of Singapore, and he leads the group research of DBS. And DBS is I think we could say that is a prominent bank in Singapore, which is committed to embed responsible banking and sustainability finance into the fabric of society. In his job, Tim oversees a group of 70 plus economists, strategists, investment analysts. Tim is also a friend and an ardent proponent of Economics of Mutuality as a way to complete capitalism so that sustainability in business can become a reality of every day. He's been a fervent supporter of spreading Economics of Mutuality in the finance world in Asia. And also recently, Tim has been a speaker at a number of NEOM events and has hosted a NEOM panel discussion at last year's DBA's Asian Insight Conference, which is a prominent event in the region. Thank you, Tim. It's an honor to welcome you in this webinar. And I just would like to start this series of questions to remember that the panel of today is about the power of investment to achieve purpose, and how should institutional investors promote purpose in the companies in which they invest, and what are the challenges faced in doing that. And for those who are interested, the chapter in the book that refers to this specific webinar is chapter 18. So I'd like to start with you, Celeste. As you know, the NEOM paradigm, we rely on the centrality of purpose to drive strategy and the power of mobilizing, measuring, managing financial and non-financial capital to achieve higher level of performance and impact. So we know that you've been following Economics of Mutuality for some time, and we are currently in discussion to turn the Economics of Mutuality movement into an investment framework that goes beyond ESG reporting and impact investing into something that's more performant. So my first question for you would be, do you think there is a future for such an approach in the investment world? And how do you see this approach applying to a city of the future like the one you're involved in NEOM? And maybe if we have time, I'd like to get your perspective on the recent explosion of ESG type of investment, and what are, from your perspective, the shortcomings from an investor point of view, and how do you see this trend developing in the future? The floor is yours, Celeste, and we'd like to give you like 10 to 12 minutes to respond.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and thank you to the NEOM team and Saïd Business School. It's thank you for what you do, and thank you for having me today, tackling such a engaging topic, how long-term investor can promote putting purpose into practice among the company they invest in and engaging with their subsidiaries. Actually, this question was the answer to my quest to find purpose and a way to put purpose into practice at a personal, professional, academic level. And I guess that's the reason why I ended up supporting long-term investors, more specifically sovereign funds, in this difficult and challenging, but as well exciting and important at the global level task. And eventually ended up here in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, where actually today is the second day of Ramadan, so Kareem Ramadan tool for the month. I'm working for the largest PIF Giga project, but both in terms of budget and size, NEOM, the city of the future, a $500 billion Giga project for a size of the land that is more than 27,000 square kilometers. Without any doubt, this is the right momentum for long-term investors to look beyond the ESG. And the reason why I found in supporting long-term investors a way to put my own purpose into practice and to achieve a measurable, sizable, and effective way to promote impact is because, of course, of their size. We know the sovereign funds by themselves as the global asset under management of more than $8 trillion, pension fund even more, and we can go into endowments, foundation, and if you consider also the impact they can have through their subsidiaries and as well asset managers, we can have a huge impact. But beside the size, I think it's very important to say that what is unique for long-term investors, specifically for sovereign pension fund, is that it is embedded in their mandate, beside the achievement of the financial return and performance, to achieve what we consider an impact goal or a double or triple bottom lines. And I guess that this is the right momentum as if we look at the history and evolution of long-term investors' awareness for a need beyond the financial return in order to accomplish their mandate and their fiduciary duty, we see how the current awareness of this need came from a long journey. And I take you with me to embark in this journey that moved from 2008 with a group of sovereign, 23 different sovereign funds with the support of IMF, realized that it was not enough to perform at a financial level, but it was important to prove that the way these long-term investors were performing was transparent and based on a solid governance structure. And that's why in 2008, the 24 Santiago Principle have been created, 3 different indexes to measure sovereign fund transparency have been created, but it was not enough. On the long journey, being transparent and well-governed was still missing something. So a few of the sovereigns, namely the Norwegian, the Australian, the New Zealand, decided that the next step was to adopt some ethical guidelines, and most precisely an exclusionary approach, to be sure that whatever they were investing in, they were not supporting companies, or eventually they were right to the point to divest from companies that were polluting the environment, violating human rights, or producing tobacco or arms. And again, it was still not enough. So moving from an exclusionary approach, it was the need actually to identify this company that might have a positive impact. And so we are moving from an exclusionary approach to an engaging approach. So divesting was not enough, but actually engaging with its subsidiaries. And I think that's one of the elements of my answer, how long-term investor should put purpose into practice is engaging with their subsidiaries, with the company they invest in, and of course, walk the talk. So they should first start from their own structure, governance, and put purpose into their own structure, consider yourself as a corporate, and then walking the talk, cascade down in their subsidiaries and the company they invest in. So in order to do so, of course, I guess that a very important driver that over time has been internationally recognized is that being sustainable is not going to affect your profitability, but actually on the long term can enhance it. And I think this is very clear. And it started all about considering integrating in the investment guidelines climate change related risk and opportunities. So we moved from a G focused approach or governance focused approach to an environment focused approach. And we moved from an exclusionary approach to an integrating approach. But still, it was not enough. So I will bring you with me on this long journey. Of course, amid pandemic, the social element or the S of the ESG became very important. So nowadays, of course, there's increased awareness that being sustainable and adopting and integrating ESG criteria in strategic portfolio allocation is profitable on the long term, or could be profitable, of course. But again, I guess that this is the right time to go beyond all this. And I guess that the newly developed interest for monitoring the contribution of investment from long-term investors in terms of contribution to the UN SDGs prove that the consideration of the impact on global stakeholders from long-term investors that by themselves are considered universal owners because of the large ownership and impact on the markets. So being universal owners, beside the specific mandate of different funds and the specific mandate of different countries that own the funds, specifically for sovereign fund and partially for some of the pension fund, there is a global implicit mandate that could be measuring the contribution to the UN SDG, but it actually can perfectly fit the EOM framework in terms of stakeholders related consideration. And I guess that the link is still there. Why we need to do so? Because it's right, but also because on the long term it's proved to be profitable. So I guess that's very important that these concepts are embedded in the mandate and belief of different long-term investors, endorse, and then cascade down to the companies these sovereign invest in or relate to. And I guess that on one side, it's very important how we do so. And we saw already with the ESG approach how many difficulties and challenges long-term investors had to face: lack of data, lack of standardization, difficulties in measuring the impact, different kind of definition. And I would say that with the new trends of long-term investors seeking for niche of return, specifically increasingly investing in tech-related sectors or tech-related solution for traditional sector, we're talking about agri-tech, fintech, and others. I guess that the next step is also how we can customize this approach for companies that are not necessarily always listed, where data are available, but companies that are at their early stage. And I guess this is the case of many new target of investment for long-term investors, from startup, not directly, maybe through asset manager or partners, but through startups, through VC and others. So I guess that another important element is the capacity to have a stewardship program on the long term to be sure that we are not only cascading down our belief, value, and approach, but also help companies that are not necessarily able to do so by themselves in changing the approach. And I have just 2 points to conclude, maybe one on specifically on the stewardship approach, and the second one maybe on NEOM itself. So on the stewardship approach, I guess that the UM framework, it's very different than the ESG approach, especially for the E element. So I guess that on one side is more fitting for measuring the efficiency of the company itself in terms of resources, use of resources and others, but as well needs great support because there's a change in the paradigm of many of how many investors are used to approach the E element. On the other side, I guess that the proof that there's an interest from several funds into measuring the contribution to UN SDG is the project I'm working for, NEOM itself. NEOM, in fact, is one of the initiatives of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to contribute to UN SDG number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. So beside walking the talk, engaging with subsidiaries, I guess there are special initiatives such as Giga Project that can contribute to the long-term investors, endorsements, and creation of impact. This is the key of NEOM itself. 2 words about this visionary project. The aim of the project is more than infrastructure projects to create an ecosystem, an accelerator of human progress, the best practice for livability, sustainability, and cognitive city. So itself at the project level, it's important to measure and to have the ability to understand the contribution at the global level in terms of impact. And this is a great challenge, obviously, and that could not be limited to the contribution to the UN SDG. So here I see that the potential application of the NEOM framework at the Giga project level, but as well, the project itself that has many different layers of sustainability. We were talking about the city of the future. So the city has different sectors, and all these sectors have been rethought in a sustainable and innovative way. So when we talk about energy, we're talking only about 100% renewable energy, water, zero liquid discharge water, mobility, self-driving electric vehicle, or green hydrogen power one. So is the reality the by itself is sustainable, but it doesn't mean that can be even better. And we have NEOM, and this is another layer where the UN framework can be considered in terms of applications, is the NEOM investment fund, that is the financial vehicle of NEOM to invest abroad, to bring the technologies required by the different sectors in order to implement their own strategies. So this is a different kind of application. So it's not a top level, bigger project level, but is how you can eventually use this kind of framework for the fund to invest in technologies and support this company also to follow the belief and be sustainable on the long term through the adoption of this framework. Of course, NEOM itself has many other elements and aspects. We have a very strong mandate in order to preserve the nature. So the city will be built only for 5% of the land that we have at our disposal, and 5% will be in natural reserve. But also in that, how much this contribute to the overall city is a different kind of element. So how we can apply this in measuring how urbanism can itself support the achievement in terms of livability and sustainability. So I guess this is even a further step on how we can use the UM approach on a different level, on a different perspective, and moving from a several funds into Giga project into VC fund.
Well, thank you very much, Celeste. I have a couple of questions actually regarding the history that you described from the focus of governance and to the focus on the environment, and now the focus on sustainability. And I had a couple of questions before we move to the next speaker, because I'm really intrigued by what do you see from your perspective? What events, from your perspective, triggered the passage from the different steps? So essentially, you described that there was some sort of awareness in 2008 to bring a higher level of governance and transparency in that space of investment. But eventually, what do you think triggered the interest from the finance committee to get more aligned with the E aspect of ESG and eventually the S aspect? And where do you think we are? And there is a quote that I often share with my friend, my colleagues. It's a quote of a German philosopher called Schopenhauer, who said that truth goes through 4 stages. That the first stage that it is ignored, the second stage is that is being ridiculed, the third stage is that is being violently opposed, and the fourth stage that it is accepted as self-evidence. So on this journey that you describe, where do we think we are as an investment community, and to what extent the community is also homogeneous behind this topic?
Thank you very much, Bruno. Your question was terrific and very interesting. I would not say that there was a willingness to ignore. I would say that with specific reference to sovereign are actually very young entities. The first sovereign funds was the Kuwait Investment Authority established in the 50s. So I would say there are multiple factors that prompt this evolution. First of all, it was the structure itself of the fund. They were not so sophisticated as they are now. They really increased the level of sophistication and also create in-house department for tackling new kind of sectors as well as new activities. So I would say that sovereign funds are still in the journey of refining their ESG integration in their investment guidelines and their investment approach. Of course, this is not the case for all of them. There are some best practices, as I mentioned earlier. So I guess the reason why this happened was being internally ready for that. And of course, in order to satisfy their fiduciary duty, especially some of the sovereign, the Norwegian and others, they had definitely to satisfy their stakeholder requests. So on one side, there is a stakeholder as well, sophistication, and they need to know if this is the money that actually belongs to the country, to the citizen. We need to know how it's governed, how it's spent. And now we're sure that for some of the sovereign fund, this is gonna really serve our future generation. So it's an internal level of increased internal level of sophistication, is an external increased requirement from stakeholders. And overall, I think another important element is the fact that it was not clear since the beginning that being sustainable wouldn't affect profitability. I guess actually that at the beginning, there was a great challenge in proving that being sustainable didn't mean being not profitable. And I guess in a way, it's a little bit the change I think you mentioned earlier, moving from charity to philanthropy, right? So giving for free or giving in the right way that can enable potential return on the future. And I guess that's a little bit also the NEOM approach, where I'm going to invest, where is the community that can allow me to have, where is the social capital that can allow me to have a better return on my investment. So I guess that the fact that being sustainable have been proven to be profitable on the long term. But I guess that nowadays the biggest challenge is how can I do so? How can I refine my approach? And I can measure it. So with different kind of standard, different kind of data, I guess the next level is how can we really arrive to the point where we can share common standard and how we can refine our way to be sustainable in order to maximize profitability, because at the end of the day, long-term investors should be profitable, and this is in their mandate, but as well impactful. And in my opinion, and I guess for sure in the NEOM point of view, that cannot happen, especially on the long term, if we don't take in consideration stakeholders. And I guess a lot of work has been done in order to be able to integrate this consideration. But I guess if we want to be effective, we need to create scale. So maybe the next challenge to properly answer your question is how we create scale. And for sure, if you want to create scale, and that was the beginning of my career, I guess we need to involve long-term investors. And we need to also refine the way they engage with their subsidiaries and their peers. So another reason why, and maybe I'll conclude here, this change happened is because many of the sovereign wealth funds, if they want to co-invest with others, if they want to participate, for example, to the Santiago Principal Group, the International for Sovereign Wealth Fund, they need to accomplish some requirements. And that goes the other way around. Nowadays, all the companies knows that, especially early stage company, if they want to attract capital, they need to prove to be well governed. They need to prove that they have a sound structure, and eventually and preferably they're also ESG compliant, because it's something that long-term investors are looking and general investors are looking at. So I guess that increase of knowledge and awareness that on the long term, ESG that could be even considered pure proper risk management can support the profitability of the companies and the company's attraction for capital. I think these two elements have been the major driver for the overall change.
Well, thank you very much, Celeste. I think it's a wonderful description that you provided, and also a lot of food for thought. And actually, the idea that you want to create scale, you need to involve long-term investors and also investing community is actually an excellent segue to ask you a few questions, Tim. So, given you have an executive position at the largest bank in Southeast Asia, and actually, as some say, the most influential bank, and given your personal interest in the Economics of Mutuality, in the recent attendance of the Oxford Executive Dictionary course, can you share with us today your vision on how the paradigm that we are proposing can transform the banking space, specifically probably in the management of risk? And my second question would be also quite close to the one I asked to Celeste, would be like, how does this Economics of Mutuality differ from sustainability programs and traditional ESG reporting, specifically in the banking industry? And then I also like to ask you a few questions about how does the Asia-Pac region, and maybe in particular, how China in particular, would fit in that space. We know that actually the vision of time, the time horizon of investment is also closely connected to the culture of these different countries, and also to the relationship with the community and the environment. So I'd like to hear a little bit your perspective from someone who is based in Asia, and how, I mean, I know Asia is very diverse and very different, but also, is there a specific Asian approach to this kind of issues, and specifically how the agenda of China is informing the thinking of investors in the years to come? Thank you, Tim. I know they are difficult questions, but the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll take it one at a time. So if I forget one of them, you can remind me. I'll take the first one, which is, what is my perspective, having been a head of research for a number of years for DBS, and then getting exposed to Economics of Mutuality in the last couple of years. So my starting point is, if you look at what we do as a bank or in the banking business, it's about taking capital and committing it to a user of the capital, right? So in the case of corporate financing, corporate loans, we're basically taking a chunk of capital and committing it to a company, right? A corporate entity. And there are a couple of ways to approach it. I mean, one is to just look at the usual credit analysis, the usual equity analysis, and say, okay, from a statistical point of view, are we likely to get paid back? But actually, at the core of this intermediation process is the need to really assess, is this the right management? Is it the right company? What are they going to do with the capital? Are they going to be able to generate, sufficient cash flow to repay the loan? Or in the case of an equity investment, are they going to generate sufficient returns on the equity investment to be able to give, increased shareholder value? So that is the starting point of banking or the financial intermediation process. Then my sense has been, having looked at the Economics of Mutuality, having been privileged to join the Oxford Executive Education Program, and hearing from different colleagues at Mars who've been working with this for some time, or different course mates from Mars over some time, I feel this is a very powerful approach, because at the end of the day, a company that is focused on fulfilling a particular purpose, a company that is aware of all of the mutual interests and particularly the vulnerabilities, right? If they take care of one particular stakeholder, say financial stakeholder, ignore the natural capital or ignore the social capital, they effectively don't have a robust business. So that's my perspective on it. Going to your question about within the context of Asia, let me skip to the third question and bring that in. Why this is particularly compelling for me in Asia, in the context of Asia. So DBS is, as you rightly pointed out, we were the Development Bank of Singapore. And because of that heritage, we tend to take a very long view as a long-term, we grew up as a long-term financing bank for the Singapore story. And so now that we have grown out of Singapore and we're looking at Asia, we really do take a very long view, right? And to me, the long view, there are actually two sides of that coin, right? One side has to do with the usual sustainability piece, which is in vogue right now. But to me, the bigger question, again, as a long-term investor, is where will the growth come from? And one statement that has been made by the EOM community, one of the truisms, is that effectively, if you are able to find a profitable solution to the problem of people and planet, you have a strong sort of growth platform, right? So for me, if I look at Asia, there are a few things. One is that there's a lot of growth potential just because of the large population, positive demographics, and potential for economies to develop as they leverage on new business innovations. So to me, if you look at it, if Asia has a problem, whether it's in the area of logistics, whether it's in the area of the environment, then to me, that's an opportunity for companies to apply themselves to solve those problems. And if they do so, there's a long growth runway. I'll give you one very sort of present example. Those of you who follow the venture capital scene and the whole SPAC phenomenon will know that there's a company called Grab, which is the ride-sharing, started out as a ride-sharing company in Singapore, is getting ready, right, to be taken over and to merge with a SPAC with a $50 billion valuation. If you look at the Grab story, effectively, they were very clever to be able to leverage technology to build social capital, right, among the drivers that were in the network. And from there, they are now pivoting into other areas of business, right? So they built one area in the EOM framework, and on the back of that, it's now a $50 billion valuation. So to me, this is an interesting, if someone were to come to me and say, oh, it's all talk right now, I think we just have to look at companies like Grab and realize that there is actually real substance to companies looking at problems, opportunities in Asia, applying the EOM framework and using that as a strategy to build their growth platform right across Asia. China would be another good example where I think this is particularly compelling. One of the issues that China obviously has been dealing with in their transition from export-led growth to now a more sustainable, domestically driven growth platform, really is this whole idea of having fair distribution. I mean, we saw this recently with the antitrust, fine on Alibaba. So making sure that companies grow in a fair way, And I think if you look at the recent Alibaba announcement, that was quite interesting. The whole wording of it, they talked about pulling their sleeve rather than giving them a slap. So I think there is this whole idea that there is a mutuality of interest. And this goes, as an ethnic Chinese myself, I think it goes quite deeply into the culture of the Chinese people to recognize that growth needs to happen in a mutual way. And so my sense is that, again, this whole framework is quite important as a guiding platform for Chinese state-owned enterprises and private enterprises to grow in a sustainable way. Your second question was about what is the difference between ESG and the Economics of Mutuality, or EOM. So so I go back to an illustration that actually struck me, and I think Bruno, you were the one that once shared this in one of the conferences I attended, that the way to think about it is that if you were to imagine that there was a tree and you were trying to measure the shadow that the tree casts, and let's say that shadow was sort of the environmental or the ESG footprint, then to me, ESG represents the work of measuring the footprint that the tree casts, or what is the ESG footprint cast by this business. And to me, EOM is actually taking a pair of shears or or taking a ladder and going up and pruning the tree, right? Shaping the tree in a way that is real, that is permanent, that throws off the right footprint on the ground, right? So I don't see them as, I see them as, in a sense, I wouldn't even use the word complementary, but they're two parts of this entire initiative to actually think about how businesses can operate in a more sustainable manner. ESG serves to measure the sustainability metrics, while I believe a company that then embraces EOM and uses it to drive objectives, to reward their management, actually shaping the tree in a way that allows it to give off the right footprint on the ground. So that's how I kind of view these two things.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. We already have a few questions from the Q&A chat room that I'd like to share with you, but then I would like to get also the perspective of Colin, specifically on one of the points that both of you raised, which is essentially the need to have data, the need to have standards, and also the need to have an agreed methodology to accelerate the shift that we are witnessing. Maybe a first question for you, Celeste. It said, what attention is NEOM giving to partnering by its portfolio companies, not only to the SDG number 17, but also beyond, and to basic collaboration between companies and harness new technologies? Maybe like a 2-minute answer to this question, which I think is quite interesting, because to make sense of that, why did you choose this SDG and what are you doing with the others?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. So just to clarify, the overall Giga project is one of the initiatives that the Kingdom is using to contribute to the ESG number 11, sustainable cities and communities. But I guess that the very interesting part of the question is how NEOM itself, through its partnership and the choice of technology that we're using to create the city of the future, are really having an impact. So I guess this is a very fundamental question. So because of the budget, NEOM cannot be created by its own one. $500 billion cannot come from PIF, but actually the way we're going to achieve this is create an ecosystem with like-minded partners that have in mind our same belief and are eager to create the future and reinventing the future while living it. And I'm saying this because our major milestone is to have 1.2 million people living in NEOM by 2030, 5 million visitors. And actually, digital nomad will be able to visit NEOM virtually through VR and AR headset and through digital identity, digital wallet, without being physically present. So the idea is to harness those technology that are at the same time sustainable and innovative. And I would add a third element that's very important and many times forgotten, that sustainable is not just in terms of energy, of ESG, but it's financially sustainable. And I think this element should be stressed because NEOM itself should contribute by 2030, 180 billion SAR to the Saudi GDP. And as well, when we talk about 100% renewable energy in terms of sector, we didn't decide this top down. Actually, we made a comparison on the financial viability, sustainability on the long term of an hydrocarbon power energy sectors and a renewable power energy sectors. And starting from scratch, not having any heritage, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is a very low cost for barrel, $5 per barrel of oil, it ended up that actually was more financially sustainable on the long term to have 100% renewable energy sectors. So we're looking for those technology partners who are able to anticipate the change in the future through their technology in a sustainable way and a financially sustainable way. And I guess that's a very important element because even if you look beyond ESG and EOM, at the end of the day, we're really talking about efficiency. So an internal perspective, how can we do things in a more efficient way now and in the future? And we're talking about improving profitability as a consequence and having a better impact. So I guess that's a very important element. There is the way we select technologies and the way we select partners is exactly this. How can they support us in achieving the transformation of the vision into reality? And I give you just a very small example of one of the partnerships. So we recently made a partnership with Air Products and Aqua Power for the establishment in the NEOM industrial city of the largest green hydrogen manufacturing plant for a budget of $5 billion and offtake of 15 billion. And this is from especially Japan and Europe due to the new regulation. So I guess being able to anticipate new regulation and create those technologies that are sustainable, are innovative, but also able to satisfy the request in the future and the change in regulation, I think this is a very important element for NEOM, for the EOM approach itself, and for being sustainable. I hope I answered the question.
No, they're very clear. And thank you very much, Celeste. I have another question, probably I will direct to Tim. And it is a quite interesting question because it is coming probably from a very practitioner point of view. So what do you think are the next steps for investors or companies who have a short to medium term investment need or short, medium term exposure in their investment? Where do they go here to what we say complete capitalism? Maybe you like to give an answer from a banking perspective.
Yeah, so a good question. My sense is this: if you look at what constitutes the value of a firm today, say looking from an equity investment point of view, it is basically the future cash flows of the company, and basically divided by a particular discount rate. So if I were a management today and I wanted to deliver short-term results to my investors, the best way to do that in terms of completing capitalism is to sit down with your management team, seriously deep dive into what the economics of mutuality represents and how this can provide a true north for your business to really have a purpose that is meaningful. You're addressing a meaningful problem of people and planet, and have an entire strategy to essentially put the company on a new course of growth and sustainability and begin to execute on that, right? How that translates into short-term market signaling to investors is that effectively, if any company can come to me and tell me, look, this is the opportunity that we have to grow our business over the next 5, 10, 15 years. These are the strategies we're adopting, and these are the metrics we're looking at to ensure that we don't get any unnecessary risks. Two things happen. One is that your long-term growth rate or the market's perception of the long-term growth rate of your company goes up. The other is that if you're addressing any externalities and any risks in a very sustainable way, your beta actually comes down, right? The net result of that is effectively you get a higher valuation today, into your share price based on what future direction is for the company. Now, again, of course, it's important not just to talk the talk, but you need to begin to walk the walk. And because EOM actually is a practice that can be used to drive management accounts and drive management KPIs, my guess is that if a company truly embraces this and starts to redefine what they measure for their management, operational management, it will start to show up in terms of the quarterly numbers, right? So I really believe that in that sense, it's something that if you were to practice it properly today, it would actually result in a higher valuation multiple from a public market or even a private market perspective.
Well, thank you, Tim. And actually, you're raising an important point, which is a nice segue to the question I have for Colin. Well, Colin, as we are positioning the Saïd Business School of Oxford as a global hub for the study of purpose measurement, but also of the future of performance measurement and accounting, which is actually it's a critical component to turn what Tim talked about into a reality. So to help investors and the business community to understand actually that putting purpose into practice and applying the EOM framework is a way actually to increase the value of your firm, and not only in the long term, but also in the short and medium term. How do you envision the role of investment in bringing purpose to life in the corporate world that goes actually beyond ESG reporting, but also that goes beyond impact investing, which is also another word that's actually developing the literature and among business, but which is often perceived as a way of doing good at a cost.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruno. Let's just go back to that notion of the purpose of business we've set out in the book, and which Tim mentioned, namely to solve problems, to solve the problems that you and I as individuals, as customers, employees, and investors face, as societies of communities and nations around the world, and as the natural world. And that business needs to find a way of doing this that is commercially viable, financially sustainable, and profitable. The purpose of business is therefore to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. So notice that by definition, a purposeful business is value enhancing for its investors, because profits are earned where there are solutions, not problems, conferred on others. It is by definition beneficial for its investors, and it's in the interest of investors to encourage companies to adopt these purposes. But also notice that for this to be consistent with promoting the interests of other parties as well as investors, then profits need to be measured in such a way that they are recorded where there are benefits, not detriments, conferred on others. Now, that is not always the case at present. There are immense benefits that companies do confer on their customers, employers, employees, and societies. But profits are also earned where business imposes detriments on others, sometimes very serious detriments, from how people are employed, how they're treated in their supply chains, how they're damaged from the addictive products that they consume. And profits are earned from increasing inequality, growing social exclusion, and environmental degradation. So profits are earned not just from wealth creation, but also from what one might term wealth transfer, namely wealth that is created at the expense of other parties. Now, we should obviously acknowledge and report profits that can be distributed to their shareholders where there is wealth creation, but not where there is wealth created at the expense of others, namely where it's wealth transfer. That is just a mistaken notion of a profit. We simply have a misconception of what is a profit. We're attributing a profit where, according to any reasonable interpretation of it, there isn't one. Now, establishing the accounting system that measures profits correctly is precisely the exercise we are currently engaged in and well advanced in achieving at Oxford.
Well, thank you very much, Colin, for this answer. And I think we also have a question which is related to what you just described. And I wish I could answer, but I'm the moderator. I am not a participant in the panel. But maybe this question is for you again, Colin. So how do you define growth? Which is it purely financial growth, or should it be the quality of growth?
So growth has to be acknowledged exactly in the way in which I'm describing profits as being acknowledged, where there has been a real enhancement of the well-being of people and the planet in general. And the type of problem that I'm just describing as arising in terms of the way in which we measure profits is equally applicable in the way in which we measure national income and then undertake national accounting as well as corporate accounting. And the fact that we are misstating profits at a corporate level means that we are also mistaking income at a national level. So the problem about motivation that we're talking about arises not just in relation to companies, but more generally in terms of how we conceive of the notion of growth of nations as well as growth of companies. So what we need to do is to derive measures of income as well as profit that correctly reflect the true costs that companies create and incur in the process of the activities that they undertake. A lot of those activities are beneficial in terms of their outcomes. They create real growth, but many of them have the impact of diminishing the well-being. They have a negative impact on certain elements in society. And again, we cannot account for the growth that is occurring until we've correctly also accounted for the cost of cleaning up the mess.
And actually, we have a question which is related a little bit to what you just shared, Celeste, Colin, and Tim. Because of course, we are talking here a lot about the market forces, which actually is the theme of this webinar, which actually is the role of investment in driving financial capitalism into a more complete form of capitalism. But beside the market forces, that I'm reading the question now, beside the market forces driving the increased focus on companies on sustainability, is there a role to be played by the public sector? And I understand here it's government regulation to penalize companies who do not align with sustainability principles. And I'd like also to add, instead of just looking at the negative side, which is the penalization of companies that do not behave properly, there is also an element of rewarding companies that are developing a responsible business model. To what extent the EU taxonomy, which is actually developing at the moment, could be enough, or is there a need for a more substantial approach, perhaps fiscal? Who wants to answer this question? We have a few more minutes, but I think it's an important one to connect the role of investment and the role also of policymakers.
Happy to take in case.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think it's a terrific question. And the example I made earlier about green hydrogen, it's clearly related to the change in regulation, the upcoming change in regulation. So we also had a private gathering among sovereign representatives. And our major question was, should we, in order to support sustainability, should we go top down or bottom up? And I guess that, as you suggested, Bruno, there should be two ways, top down, bottom up, but not only in penalizing, but actually also in supporting. So the first answer is yes, I guess that the bigger steps should be taken by government. And we should not also forget that, by the way, sovereign are owned by government. So in a way, changing the policy of the sovereign funds is still coming from a government's perspective. But with specific reference to my country, or my former country, Italy, the subsidy that have been put in place in order to support the generation of renewable energy, unfortunately, just for a short time, produce a strong effect, both at the economic level and the proliferation of small and medium enterprises in the south of Italy, able to generate new employment, new incomes. So I guess that the role of regulators is very important, but it's not enough by itself. I guess that should be complemented by long-term investors and as well from companies and individuals.
Well, thank you very, very much, Celeste, for your comprehensive answer. As we are reaching the end of our webinar, we won't have a chance to answer to all the questions that you have put on the Q&A. But I hope actually that this panel that we just that we need to finalize now is just the beginning of a series of meaningful conversations that will have long-lasting consequences. I would like to finish to thank each of you, Celeste, team, and Colin, and also thank you, Nick, also for organizing, and Oxford also for making this possible. I want to thank you, each of you who attended this webinar, and I hope we will have a chance to meet with you in person in the coming months, post-COVID. And I just want to remind you that we have another panel next week at the same time. And during this panel, we will focus on the importance of education. And as we started this webinar series with Paul Polman, and we talked about what it takes to achieve a systemic change in society. And there are 4 pillars to achieve systemic change. The first one is the creation and dissemination of knowledge with education. The second one is the implementation in real business operations, which is what we do with Economics of Mutuality. The third one is about bringing the investment community on board, which was the topic of today. And the last one is, of course, to get the regulators and the policymakers interested in rewarding virtuous behaviors and penalizing irresponsible behavior. So this is actually the focus of our vision, is to achieve systemic change through education, implementation, investment, and policymaking. And next week, we're going to focus on education, which is an important topic to train not only the existing generation of leaders, but most importantly, to equip the young generations to handle the complexities and the challenges that the new context in which we operate confer on them. I want to wish you a very good evening, morning, or afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you very much, and goodbye.